and good afternoon, and welcome to Dungeons and Decolonization, a panel brought to you very specifically by Octagon because we want to talk about dungeons and decolonization. I'm sorry, I brought too much energy to that, and I am so sorry. So yeah, this is a panel wherein we talk about how the original win condition for D&D was amassing amazing loot or sometimes just surviving the adventure. Now we quest for character fulfillment and to meet new NPCs and gain experience. While player parties are often the colonial nature of the base material, are we seeing an equally enlightened view coming through the official publications? So to begin today, I would like to introduce our panelists. To begin with, Esther, could you say a little bit about yourself?
Hello, my name is Esther MacCallum-Stewart, and I'm the bid chair for Glasgow in 2024. But I'm also a professor of game studies. I still keep smiling, it was announced this week. I'm a professor of game studies, and at the moment, my specialization is how players understand and tell stories about the games that they play. So I've been writing quite a lot about D&D recently. And if anybody needs any manuals, anyone needs any rule books, I've got them all here. They're all here.
Okay.
That beholder won't even come up. So if anyone needs any reference,
actually,
I'll just pass them over.
I'm sorry. I think you might be slightly over your holding to put some of those back.
Okay.
Yeah,
sure.
too many books. And next up, we have Dav Waldron.
Hi there, folks. My name is Dav, as Daniel said. I have been my life. I started to write role-play games and LARPs with some friends over the last 15 years or so, and currently playing Dungeons and Dragons game with some friends every week, in which we explore a lot of this, because two of them are English and one of them is Belgian, and I'm an Irish guy saying, hey, you know, you did this to the world. So it comes up quite a lot.
And Gareth, Hanrahan, how are you today?
Not too bad, semi-awake. Yeah, I'm Gareth Hanrahan. I'm a game designer. I started off writing games for conventions and accidentally wandered into doing it full-time professionally, which I've been doing for 18 years now, I think.
And we also have Declan Doody.
Hi, my name is Declan. I am the creator for an Irish actual play podcast from D&D called Romancing the Dungeon. I know everyone says, you know, the forever DM trope, but I like to consider myself the eternal DM, as in I will be doing it even after I die. I've been playing TTRPGs since I was 17, so that's a good 18 years, and the vast majority of that 18 years I have been the person with control issues, so running the games and writing the games. So
And I'm Daniella Bella. I'm an artist and a writer and an activist, and I am a fan of real play TTRPGs on Twitch and YouTube, and I will be hopefully playing my first proper campaign tomorrow. So yay! I am your moderator for today, and I apologize in advance. And so to begin with, I thought it would be good to ask Gareth, what is D&D?
That's sort of a complicated question. I mean, okay, obviously Dungeons & Dragons is a role-playing game, so the first role-playing game created by Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax many years ago. It's gone through many editions since then, many versions. It sort of forked with the introduction of what's called the Open Gaming License, where basically other people could produce their own D&D variants and supplements. So basically there's Dungeons & Dragons, the game, which is published at the moment by Wizards of the Coast. There's Dungeons and Dragons the hobby, as in like, the people playing it, and there is Dungeons and Dragons the activity, as in like, going to dungeons, killing monsters, getting XP. And I'm not sure which of these we're going to talk about decolonizing, or possibly all three, but they each of them are sort of separate topics to a degree.
And Esther, what do you think Dungeons and Dragons like is right now in terms of like the broad public opinion and understanding of what the game is and how it's played?
Excuse me, sorry, I'm a bit coffee. Yeah, I feel like that's another kind of $1 million question. I'm going to kind of start with some statistics actually, because they always really surprise people. And this was from D&D Europe. They released this in 2019 before any of this our current situation had happened. And they discovered that the majority of current players are under 24. So I'm guessing that us Longhorns are we're actually now the minority. And that really surprised me, because I've always thought of my D&D groups as being the D&D groups. And that's just not true at all. But I'm seeing a lot of things with, so for example, we actually teach, or it's an optional thing whether you can study D&D in one of our modules. You can actually take any TRPG, but people tend to take D&D. So what I'm actually seeing is my students starting to create worlds, and the worlds that they are making, in some ways they're incredibly straightforward, because it's probably the first time they've played together, but in other ways they just they're so different from the worlds that I've played. And I think that's really indicative, like, what is D&D now, that whilst the worlds are very sort of, wow, these are fairly sort of, not what I wouldn't consider particularly complex worlds, because they're only just discovering storytelling. They are incredibly complex in the way that they play characters, in ways that I felt that when I was playing, certainly started to play, I had to kind of really overcome. And they're just like, nah, nah, this is what I am now. I was speaking to one of my MA students yesterday, and they said, I'm so fed up with the D&D University Union, because literally every single student is playing a tiefling, because it's one of the best ways to explore identity. And they just thought tieflings are incredibly cool, but I totally understand. I think that's really funny. So I don't know, what is D&D? Everyone's a tiefling.
Everyone is Jester Lavore.
Yes, absolutely, because everybody loves Jester, who is an indicative character in Critical Role at the moment. They play a very chaotic tiefling, and tieflings, for people who don't know, are the kind of a demonic race. But they're very specifically coded to be as many different colors as you want them to be. They present very differently, and they're very chaotic, so they're very playful as well, or at least, again, that's the dominant trope at the moment. So yeah.
And so, and in terms of those dominant tropes, how much, say, Dav, would you say that there is, those tropes are colonial hangovers or colonialist even?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that hangover that I think, broadly speaking, players are roundly kind of rejecting the idea that drow are evil or tieflings are chaotic evil. And like, we have a tiefling in our party, and he's the stage performing bard, models himself after Zorro, thinks he's going to be a hero to the people, which is lovely, because they see him coming and it's like, it's a devil, So it's that's the way we get to react and kind of work through it in our game. Yeah, as Esther was said, like the vast majority of new players seem to be embracing these sort of stranger races, that and I don't mean that as there were the less picked races in years previous, because there weren't complex or complete rule sets for them, or because people felt that you're sort of going down a certain path with this type of a character. It's lovely to see that whole idea has just been turned on its head, and people are like, that makes no sense at all. What kind of a boring story is that to tell? And ultimately, I think D&D and all kind of role plays are about telling a story and telling a more interesting story, and people prefer nuance.
So have the core materials of D&D over the years changed from have they changed in terms of just like what the end goal is, or what the players are meant to get out of it, like what's end game over the years, Declan?
I think that it's a really, really interesting question, because it's a lot of the things, when something is created, when, whether it's something like a TTRPG game like D&D, or even a film, or a book, an album, the obviously the author, the creator, has some form of intent with that. There might be an end goal. The party go out and they do something. They find loot, they defeat the big dragon, whatever it might be. But more and more, we're aware that, that product, when it enters the audience, when the audience gets to, sit down and consume that, their influence and their approach to it completely changes that. And I think that's what we're seeing in a big, big way. And as Esther was saying, that quite terrifyingly, that, it's all, the majority are under 24. And that's great, because it's bad because I'm, oh God, how old am I again? But it's that thing that, it's the audience are the ones changing that dynamic. And I don't necessarily think that's what the idea was, but I think letting the audience kind of build on that and find their own goals. And I think those goals have definitely changed, because it's no longer just about, going off and fighting and surviving a brutal dungeon. It's learning something along the way, and that's what I think a lot of people are drawn to. And even if you're looking outside of Dungeons and Dragons, like even indie TTRPGs, it's no longer about going off to do something epic. It can just be an immersive story that we all get to create.
Esther?
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, like one of the really kind of fascinating things that I discovered this year is I've got this kind of theory that D&D is actually a game that doesn't have any proper rules, because it has so many thousands and thousands of pages of rules that the rules can't possibly work. So I don't think there is anyone in the world who is playing a D&D game properly, but that's also encoded in the rule books. And I'm not going to go into this in a massive amount of detail, because I want to hear what everyone else has got to say about this. But it's really fascinating that if you read the prologues from D&D to right through 3.5, 4 to 5, that actually they don't tell you how to play. And the original D&D, because it was designed to be played at conventions, it started with an assumption that the DM would explain everything. So it doesn't actually even tell you the rules properly. It just basically says the DM will tell you how. It doesn't say roll dice in it. It's amazing. And as you go through, there's always a different version of essentially like good luck and have fun. And sometimes there's a little bit of encoding. So Gary Gygax wasn't particularly happy with the fact his game was running away from him. So in AD&D, he writes this, again, like massive warning for reading it, because it's really offensive. He's trying really hard and just gets it very wrong. But he sort of says things like, don't do these things yourself, wait until you're told what to do through the DM. And then 3.5 says things like, this is a world of imagination. That's not actually a rule, that's an instruction. It's a brilliant instruction, it's fantastic. The fourth rule set wanted you to use a very sort of systemic system, a lot of dice rolling, a lot of figures, a lot of numbers. And so that says it's a game, it's not a game for children, it's a game with miniatures and imagination. Imagination gets to be second there. And then 5ED, which we have now, really has tried to sort of open everything up. And I think that really kind of goes with what Declan was just saying. It's like, yeah, everyone reworks the world. Even from the beginning, they were doing that. But now, wow, it's everywhere. It's just this massive thing. And I just think that's really, really exciting. I mean, if you don't mind, Daniella, I was going to ask Gar what he thinks about that, because obviously you're a rules writer.
Yeah,
so...
it's fascinating. D&D, like, you grab the current rule books. it's still like, the classes are still like, fighter, ranger, slayer, go in, like, people who go in and kill things in dungeons. It has become the sort of the lingua franca of gaming. People think of role playing as Dungeons and Dragons, and it's fascinating for someone who went through the whole indie movement to watch people take this rule set, which is designed or has evolved to be about, like, go into dungeons, go on heroic adventures, basically recreating the sort of boys' own adventure, Indiana Jones pulp adventure stuff with a vague fantasy gloss, and then remake it and try to rework it to tell more elaborate stories or to do different things. There are other rule sets out there which are much, much better for telling stories, which are much, much better for, like, exploring emotional situations, for delving into character. But because everyone, or not everyone, like, because this is vast majority of gamers who play D&D and haven't covered anything else, they take this largely unsuitable tool and start reworking it. I mean, if you were going to, like, sort of sit back start from scratch and, like, we're going to create this new medium for telling stories, you would not start with D&D. But D&D is where we started, and D&D is what everyone knows. So it's sort of like rolls on in this bizarre way. It's a fascinating evolution. It's not efficient, but it's interesting.
Here's what I found.
No, go away, Siri.
Siri, what do you think about colonialism? Dab, actually, can you speak a little bit about what colonialism is, and like very specifically, like in what ways does D&D get into that?
I suppose it comes up in so many parts of the kind of core conceits of the worlds of D&D. If we're playing from the official source stuff, it's largely a feudal sort of world. There are rulers, there are castles, there are we have small villages trapped in the outskirts of a busy trade area that frequently get raided, and then the good guys will come and save them and incorporate them into their nation, or however it'll work. We've got at the minute in our game, we've had the new town of Sparata, which is a new core town that's come up, and it's been settled by Neverwinter. It's got Neverwinter guards there, and we fought we negotiated a deal between the native lizard folk in the swamp that this town was being built on to be a new commercial trade hub, because that commerce has got to keep going. And it's the perfect encapsulation of what is colonialism to the world. It's like, here it is, the invading force with all of its power and its might has appeared and said, we need this. We're going to build a shipping port here. And in our story, the lizard folk who live there is like, well, those are the former shell bodies of our gods. You're not going to dig up that island, and so that's the premise. And I don't need to get into how we solved it. It was quite fun, but it lays it all up like that. The base conceit here is colonialism is happening. You can either be a part of it or you can help prevent it. And that's it's not to say that the game is as black and white as that, but this was the conceit of our particular scenario in this case. It's interesting, I think, to see how people are much more aware of what that is. It's like, hang on a second, this isn't okay. We have now at a wider societal level started to recognize and understand what colonizing is, what it can look like, how it's presented as this is all for your own good, and we're going to be able to trade with so many more ships. It's going to make people rich. It's like, well, we'd much rather have our home, or we'd much rather have these temples to our gods. Thank you very much. They've sustained us through countless generations. What's your money going to do for us? They're just a little microcosm of kind of what it can be, what it looks like. But it's something I've seen repeated through scenarios that people have written for one shots, through some of the official stuff and so on.
Declan, do you see how do you see colonialism manifesting in the way that you've been playing D&D in your life?
I find myself again, kind of from my perspective with the show and stuff like that, I do occasionally find myself checking in with, you know, my own kind of bias and small things that I look at, maybe a particular, and this might seem silly, but like even the monsters that I might be using and what they often could have been used to represent. And, you know, Romancing the Dungeon is, you know, our whole focus is about relationships, and not necessarily romantic, although it's in the title and it's a bit confusing, but it's there. But it's we are, one of our first kind of earlier encounters was with a brother and sister who were a succubus and an incubus, and I kind of found myself kind of looking and kind of going, what do those monsters really represent? How am I going to play them without falling into a trope, and so on and so, and it you know, throughout everything that we do then on the show, even kind of the NPCs that I end up creating. So I have a tiefling NPC called Dahlia Wolfram, and yes, it is also my way of exploring a few things. Okay, I'm still doing a few check-ins, but Dahlia is a horrible person, not because she's a tiefling, just because she's a horrible person. So looking at kind of the races that are set out there, and even to an extent, even kind of the classes, you know, you'd often kind of go warlocks. Well, warlocks are, they're making deals with the, you know, quote unquote devil and so on and so forth. And our own warlock Hephaestus is just a very angry, confused young person who saw this as an outlet. It wasn't a grand design on our part to go, let's do this. And I really think particularly would say the modern approach to D&D and stuff like that. And I know there's often a lot of discussion and even discourse around this, but I think the majority of people no longer see D&D as a colonized thing. I do think it has been largely decolonized, and that's evident purely, you know, as Esther was saying, in just the volumes of worlds out there that people create and what they want to bring into it, and understanding them, like Dav was saying, that your players, your audience come into that going, no, that's not right. Like that's not right. And we watch, I mean, we can't pretend that doesn't happen in real life or hasn't happened in real life. We often look at how the party approach that issue, kind of going into it. And I think that's where we start to see a lot of the older tropes and everything, not just kind of stripped back, but I think fundamentally rejected. That, you know, you have to play it a certain way. You have to do, nah, not anymore. Nah, you want to do that way? Yeah, let's consult, let's talk about it. What's the point of this? Where are we going with this? And I think that's what a lot of people now kind of want from their game, from their dungeon master, from the group.
So Esther, do you think that perhaps are people giving D&D like a bit too much credit sometimes for the recent revival and how they've been handling the almost decolonizing work of rewriting it and like making it better, when so many other systems have for a long time been way ahead of them in terms of their inclusivity?
That's a really fascinating question, because I'm so 50-50 on it. Like, I think, you know, we've all just sort of said, everybody, as players, we reject many of the things that are kind of presented to us. I think the example of the lizard folk's fantastic, like, it's really interesting. But at the same time, I can see D&D they are trying really hard, and they don't always hit. Like, there are issues with, pretty much everything that they've tried to do recently. I know Candlekeep, which had 17 individual little mysteries in it. There was an author who was very upset about one of the portrayals of a lizard. I think they were lizard folk, actually. I think it was a very specific lizard.
Or all lizard folk.
Same time, Chris Perkins, who's the sort of big sort of public face at the moment, released a really interesting statement about a month and a half ago, where he sort of said, no canon, there is no canon anymore. Your canon is correct canon. If this character, yes, they exist in the universe, but if they're a space hamster, they're a space hamster. It's your call. And I thought that was really interesting. But also at the same time, D&D does still have its own world. It does, and yes, it does have a history that we've all rewritten and recreated. And that's full of problems. It uses the word race to describe the thing that you pick, and that in itself is a problem. And one of the things that I have noticed that they're doing, however, and I don't know whether I think this is a get out or not, is that they're moving much more to groups of characters, and I feel uncomfortable using the word race as well, that are just non-people, I guess. So Strixhaven, which is coming out relatively soon, is introducing Alkin, so Owl people. And and again, I think we've said, there's a lot of emphasis on people who are not human people, which also means that we can get away from color, we can get away from gender, and we can sort of, and as I say, I don't know whether that's a get out. I don't know whether that is an easy. One of my students did some research last year on video games, and they discovered that there are more anthropomorphized creatures in video games than people of color. And that sounds like an obvious finding, but then when you think about it, that there's more comedy squirrels than there are people of color, that's like, yeah. So my answer is wishy-washy, but I think it's good to understand that there's conflict, that, again, no matter how hard you try. I mean, look at us, the white people, or the white presenting
100%.
people,
Yeah, very well.
So, yeah.
Octagon needs to do better, honestly. But yeah, I wonder if Dav, as someone who's playing with a lot of who's playing D&D with a lot of English and Belgian people, and if you don't want to answer this is fine, but like, do you find that they come to the table with different, do they engage differently with the material than you do as an Irish person, like in terms of like what tropes they find uncomfortable?
Yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. We're a group of four. The DM is English, and one of the players is Belgian, and one of the others is English as well. We met from the Penny Arcade Discord channel based on the Penny Arcade Acquisitions Incorporated stuff, and we are playing an Acquisitions Incorporated franchise, which brings with it its own weight of colonial terror, because AI is this hyper corporate capitalist venture headed by Omen Dran, and like, we have franchises, we have fees to pay, we have staff to pay, we have a house to look after and run. We have, I won't say servants, like I said, they are staff. But yeah, and the idea is to go and make money. And so right from the off, we're set up for this. Oh, this is kind of, I'm kind of at conflict with just the premise. But we wrote our characters in such a way that they came together out of desperation. They had nothing, literally nothing, and they got made extras in a TV ad for AI. And there we go. We inherited a franchise because we signed the wrong paperwork. but yeah, the attitudes that the guys bring to the game is largely one of, we know that our country's pasts are horrible, and we're not shying away from that, which is great. Like they absolutely embrace the awkwardness, where I will make a point, perhaps when it's relevant, especially with the story I mentioned with this new town and these lizard folk who were local to it, and immediately, like, all of us were on board for, well, we're putting the lizard folks' interest first. This big town and all this big money can feck off. We're looking after the locals here, and that was, we didn't even have to discuss that. It was great. So it was lovely to see that the immediate option was to, well, we're doing the right thing here. We know what the wrong thing is, and occasionally I joke, I do make jokes with it. I get on really well with the guys, and it sounds awful, but I started speaking to our horse, and I started speaking to the horse in Irish. And so we have decided that Irish is now the language of horses.
Yes.
And so I will occasionally just say things, and I'll DM I'll send a text message to the DM to say, this is what I just said to the horse. Yep. So, and I'm not a good Irish speaker by any stretch of the imagination, but I just thought, here's a nice way to sort of introduce and reclaim something. We as a total aside, we had to rescue all the horses from essentially the Matrix, the Matrix, as we called it. All the horses who worked for Neverwinter's city were psychically imprinted in this special yard, and we saved them all from that, because we were like, well, they're slaves. Like, so what if they're horses? They're still slaves. We're rescuing the slaves. That's just not an option. So we've been very forthright in tackling these sorts of things head on, in as much as we see them. And I know we're all enjoying it. It's nice to fight back and to right some wrong, even in a fantasy setting like this. It feels a little empowering to be able to say, we did the right thing here. We know we did the right thing here.
Can I put there for a second? You say you did the right thing, but D&D is a role-playing game.
Yes.
You need to create characters who are basically going like, glory to the Empire. We are like much like you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Dominant, like you.
And the right thing would have been to conquer everything.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. But it was the I say the right thing. We as a party decided we will not stand for this. Yeah. We as individual players have our own moral code that was just like, that's not right. One of our players is a centaur, so it was a little close to home for him, even though he insists that we don't call him a horse. But yeah, the premise being the right thing for our characters, and as Gareth quite rightly points out, we could have been a party that was all about we're going to further the cause of the glorious empire. These stupid locals better get out of our way, or they can either move or they can die, and that's not something we wanted to play, but it is equally valid as a play style.
One thing I was very interested in is, like, up until the whole rise of streaming and like games being discussed more often, gaming was a very sort of like, personally, you play in your own group. What happens in your group doesn't really transmit. Whereas now, with sort of games being streamed and then discussed and so forth, what comes up in a game would be analyzed and, I don't want to say picked apart, but like, there's a much more sort of, a game has context beyond just one group. So I'm wondering, are the two things connected?
I'd say so, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, I just submitted an abstract to a Critical Role anthology, and I actually in some stages think that kind of fan voices are actually a bit more valid than academic voices, but yeah, I think that spectatorship is really, really interesting. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion about a lot of the online plays with people who've been very upset that that's not the way that they play, and they felt like they've been told how to play. That's called? The Mercer Effect again. I'm sure I'm preaching to the crowd there, but it's called the Mercer Effect after the Dungeon Master of Critical Role. And I think that tension of people who were really surprised at this kind of what felt like a really new way of playing, but then the kind of pick apart of it has been really fascinating. Like there's always been a sort of history of people writing after action reports and writing things up, but it's now that kind of, you don't actually need to play, you just need to watch thing has become really, that's actually the bit that fascinates me more than what's actually happening on the screen. When I'm watching, I'm a fan. I don't really want to talk about the sort of ins and outs of Jester Lavore as a character that's changed the way tieflings are understood. I want to kind of think about why people are doing that bit. But I agree. I mean, what do the rest of you think?
Declan?
My own background, outside of tabletop and stuff, I'm a teacher, and I've several years in television and radio production. So I'm always, I knew the second, we brought a microphone or several microphones into our game, that we had to think a little bit about the audience. And I don't mean, react in a way that's going to get the audience or something. We still, half the time, if you've ever listened to us, we forget that, we're a podcast and, we drift across the mics and so on and so forth. But the one thing I was a little kind of surprised by was, when the podcast went out, we started to get people not only, there was, because I'm not the best at remembering the rules. We had a little bit of that. But what I found most interesting was people reacting to the player characters and the NPCs in a way that I wasn't expecting. I knew people would like or dislike certain things, and that's fine. But I found myself in between season 1 and season 2 and preparing for season 2 with some decisions about, where is the story going? What are the outside influences that are going to come in here? And one of the big things I had in my head was, what are the audience going to think if X happens to this particular character, and not even a player, I mean another NPC. If I did something to an NPC, how are people going to react and respond to that? And I guess with the nature of what we do and what our show is about, and the impact of relationships, like one of our players, she's playing a Shader-Kai elf called Fia, who's a bit, she's Fia, so that's just a nice way of putting it. But when you look at her as a person, a lot of people would message us saying, she's the one that I gravitate towards. She's the one that I'm most mindful of. And we were very kind of surprised, not surprised that Fia was liked and stuff like that, but just that people were coming out and saying these things, on social media, on Twitter, on our Discord. We did get a little bit of people telling us that we were ruining D&D, which was great. Which I was like, yes, ruin it some more. I've taught a little bit about that, but that doesn't really faze me. People telling me that I don't play D&D the right way. To kind of go back to what we were saying around, there's no wrong way to play this. You know what I mean? There's no wrong way to play it. And like Gareth was saying, with Dave's campaign, they could have gone in with a different party and done it a different way, but that's a different game and a different group. And if you and your party want to sit down and you want to talk about, the complexities of road building in Neverwinter, and you want to, navigate the way through that and through Parliament and councils, do that. And if you want to go off and you want to, try and slay Tiamat, for the honor that comes with that, or even support Tiamat in a diabolical campaign, do that too. There is no right way or wrong way of doing these things.
There's a really fascinating discussion on another actual play called The Adventure Zone, and they do kind of breakdowns every so often. And one of the characters, the actor is called Travis, and his character is called Magnus. And he said that he had to stop looking at the Reddit stuff because he kept on reading things that said Magnus wouldn't do that. And he found it really, and he talks about this in the thing, and he says it was so weird because I'm Magnus. And he had this big, he said that actually he was finding that, you know, people are, he was very kind of like, people are allowed to be fans and they're allowed to, you know, ship and kind of create their own stories, but at the same time he actually had to stop reading it because he felt that there was a lot of like almost kind of performance anxiety. And I think what you're saying about the read on your character, that sounds really similar, with people gravitating towards somebody, but then perhaps adding themselves in. Like, it's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm Magnus.
Yeah, well, I've had people tell me, because that character Fia has an older brother called Quillo, and Quillo is a horrible person. He's just a very he constantly gaslights his sister. He's a master at emotional manipulation, and he's a phenomenal background player. Like, he hasn't done anything outward, and the audience have seen his interactions with his sister, but the group haven't. And I have had people go, "When's he dying? When does this guy die?" That's me. I'm that guy. Whoops.
I wonder if like in this world, there's a lot of times when casts have been constructed for example, Black people being created as a slave caste for Europe and the Americas, and from what I understand, that had a very specific root in the desires of capitalism as a system, and like the desire for labor and free labor, and so if I have it correct, that there was a sort of construction of race for the benefit of white Europeans specifically, and other Europeans. I wonder if the race making in D&D feeds into that real world race construction at all, if any of you white folks want to take that.
I mean, the classic example, I think, is the drow. You know, they live underground and their skin is black. That doesn't make any sense. Like, if you live underground, your skin would be basically white. So, you know, drow were evil. It is known, and it is bullshit. Excuse the language. You know, the ideas that where it's a fantasy trope, I suppose, in that, you know, the dwarves are miners, they live under the ground. The drow are dark elves, you know. Elves are aloof and mysterious, and they'd sooner shoot you as talk to you. You know, all of these sort of fantasy tropes that have built up over, you know, several hundred years, even several thousand years of folk tales and so on. A lot of them have been, I suppose, with the benefit of hindsight, used to other people, to other groups of people. And I think by and large, people have rejected the idea of that. And it's going to take some time to tease that out of the source material. I think we need to remember that Wizards is a gigantic mega corporation. It has shareholders, it has all of that, and none of that makes for a quick turnaround on these sorts of things. I think it's probably fair to say that the people we see, the likes of the Jeremy Crawfords or the Chris Perkinses of D&D, were public faces of the company and of the hobby, in a sense. They are very keen to make this work happen, and more importantly, they're keen to do it with the fans, because they've long since realized we don't control D&D at all. We simply own the IP, and that's they have no control over beyond that. But it feels like they're trying to guide us in a less problematic direction. And
we need to wrap up now, but in 30 seconds, Gareth, do you have any tips for a player who hasn't played in 30 years?
Talk to your GM basically would be my first tip. The game has evolved. The game and also fundamentally the game belongs to the GM and the players. And as we've established, what D&D is very, very variable depending on the group.
Declan, 15 seconds. Who would win the fight between World of Warcraft, Warhammer, and Dungeons and Dragons?
Dungeons and Dragons.
And Esther, I forget what I was going to ask you, but let's wrap this up. Could everybody reintroduce themselves and tell and say what your projects are so people can find you afterwards?
My advice was really quick. It was consciously imagine your NPCs as being different colors.
Awesome.
And don't assume they're always white. It's really easy to do. My name is Professor Esther MacCallum-Stewart.
Yeah.
And I'm also the bid chair for Glasgow 2024. And thank you for watching.
Thank you so much. And Gareth, you want to say goodbye?
Yeah, goodbye to all. Thank you all very much. If you're looking for me, then Hanrahan.com is the sort of one-stop shop for links to me.
Dav?
Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, I don't have anything to plug or promote. I'm just a nerd who works in the software industry. So,
Declan?
Thanks so much. Fantastic time, and it was great to share the last kind of hour or so with everybody. If you want to check out Romancing the Dungeon, you can find us on any place that hosts podcasts. And I have an upcoming project called Rise of the Forsaken, which will be a Twitch stream exploring family and identity and the idea of destiny.
Oh, last one. Cheryl asked in the chat. Gareth, what's your favorite edition of D&D?
Oh, I mean, favorite in terms of favorites, probably the Rules Encyclopedia, just because that's the one I had when I was 12, and D&D is also about recapturing that sort of first exposure to it.
Oh, awesome. I'm Daniella Bella, artist. I'm Burley Q Einstein on Twitter. Thanks so much, everybody. You've been awesome, and love to everybody. Goodbye. Yeah.
bye, folks.